you have this concept that, well, the majority, however, of God's people did not accept him. The majority didn't. A few did, and those are Christians. But the majority didn't, and he says, your house is going to be left to you desolate. This is a consequence of you choosing to not accept me as the Messiah. He prophesies further about this in depth in the chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, let's look at some of this here, because this is what's really fascinating. Jesus is going to show to you why we don't have the sacrificial system and why this talk of bringing it back is absurd at the end of the day. If you look at Matthew 24, let's go to let's start at 27. Yeah, let's go there. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And so he's saying he's going to come from the east. By the way, this is why Christians historically have prayed facing east. It's called ad orientem worship. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Vultures, that's a reference to the Romans. So he's doing two things here. He's pointing to his coming, and this isn't the second coming, if you will, though it may be a foreshadowing of it. He's referring to a coming in judgment, and he ties that into something that the Romans are going to do. Well, that's curious. What did the Romans do right around that time? Well, they destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And Jesus even says to them, this generation will not pass before these things happen. So he can't be referring to his second coming, because the second coming didn't happen. He's referring to him coming in judgment, to judge his people and to destroy the temple. And he uses the Romans to do so. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, obviously that didn't happen literally, but here's what's curious. The temple was seen as a microcosm of creation. It was seen as a microcosm of what's going on with the sun, moon, stars, and the heavens. The temple is a microcosm. It's a mini universe. It's a mini heavens. So when he says the moon's going to be darkened, stars will fall from heaven, powers of heavens will be shaken, he's referring to the destruction of the temple, not to a literally the sun is going to fall out of the sky or something like that. He's referring to the destruction of the temple. Then will appear in heaven the sign of man. Listen to that. That's important. Josephus is going to talk about that, which we'll see here in a moment. Josephus is a Jewish historian a little bit after the time of Jesus. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. What sign is that? We'll see in a moment. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That's a reference to the book of Daniel. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. That refers to evangelization. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, what things? The destruction of the temple. You know that he is near at the very gates. Interesting reference to gates, by the way. You'll see why here, according to Josephus. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Was Jesus a false prophet? Did his prophecy fail? If he's referring to his second coming and the end of time, then he's a false prophet, because clearly that generation passed away and none of that happened. But he's not referring to his second coming. And he's not referring to the end of the world per se. He's referring to his coming in judgment against the destruction of the temple, and the temple being a microcosm of the world. And so we could speak of the destruction of the world in the form of the temple in a mini version, in a microcosmic version. And perhaps these things will also point to a greater, in a foreshadowing way, in a greater way to the end of time, in a macrocosm, maybe. But all he's talking about here is coming in judgment. We also know that because he ties these things into the book of Daniel and some prophecies there that we see with the abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel, which is going to be important, as we'll see here in a moment. But again, he's referring to the destruction of the temple, because in this prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, it's very clear it's in reference to the destruction of the temple. And that's what the abomination of desolation is. So clearly in the context, he's referring to the destruction of the temple and his coming in judgment, not to his second coming and the end of time. Let's actually take a look at some things that Josephus said. Because what Josephus said, when we compare what Jesus just said and corroborate it with the account of the Jewish historian Josephus, it just really starts to become fascinating. And again, it goes to explain why we no longer have sacrifices and prayers in the form of animal sacrifices. Josephus says this is in his The Wars of the Jews. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it. In other words, he's about to tell us something just incredible in nature. He says, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals? For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. He's referring at the time to the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He's saying at the time of the destruction of the temple, there were some weird things going on, and people saw in the heavens troops of soldiers in their armors in chariots running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. That's interesting, because what did Jesus say in Matthew 24? Well, he talked about the sign in heaven. There will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. The exact same themes. A sign, clouds. You're seeing that being fulfilled according to the testimony of the Jewish historian who did not believe in Jesus, the Jewish historian Josephus, who also, by the way, links the destruction of the temple prophesied in Daniel to what's going on with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So Reason in Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from RNT, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help RNT Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason in Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to RNT at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support RNT in the show description. God bless. Josephus is corroborating the fulfillment of these prophecies, the destruction of the temple, in the coming of judgment of the Son of Man in 70 AD. He also points to other incredible signs. He says, I suppose the account of it would be a fable were it not related. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men. So it took about 20 men to move this gate, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened deep into the firm floor. So not only does it take 20 men to move it, but it's clearly locked into place. It says, which they're made of one entire stone, so it's a large piece of stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. So already he's saying, look, on its own, this massive gate that takes 20 people to move, and it's already fastened into the ground, so it's not going anywhere, on its own moved. It opened. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon, running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open the gate of happiness. So some were interpreting this in a positive way. Well, maybe God's going to open the gate of happiness for us. But Josephus says, but the men of learning, that is the wise men, understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. So Josephus is saying the fact that the gate opened, God allowed this to happen to warn them and show them they are about to have the destruction of the temple. You're going to have the siege of Jerusalem. It's going to be sacked. Horrible things happen there. And you're going to have the destruction of the temple. God was giving them warning signs of these things. And then one other. This is curious because God was showing to the people of Israel at this time that their sacrifices were no longer effective. Their animal sacrifices were no longer effective. And in fact, this happened in the last 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple. Now, when was the temple destroyed? 70 AD. What's 70 minus 40? 30. What happened around 30 AD? Around that time. Well, you have Jesus's crucifixion. And you have over and over and over, according to the Talmud, so according to Jewish sources, you not only have these warning signs, but you also have God giving or using miracles and also not continuing certain miracles to show them that their sacrifices, their animal sacrifices, are no longer accepted. And it happened in the last 40 years. Well, why would God no longer accept sacrifices of animals in the last 40 years prior to 70 AD? Well, because that once and for all sacrifice of the Messiah was offered. So Reason in Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from R&T, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help R&T Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason in Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to R&T at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support R&T in the show description. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.